Well, good evening.
Evening.
How lovely to see you, and thank you for coming. For those of you who come back, thank you for coming back. And I hope we have another interesting, I hope, and productive evening. As you'll know, you'll have seen the signs around town and heard me talk about it in church. We are trying to address some of the big questions that I think the people have got. Because I thought that would be helpful. It'd be helpful to those of us who are regular churchgoers. We've got exactly the same questions, by the way, and helpful to those who never darken the door of church and everyone who's part way in between. These are real questions, aren't they? We had a really good session last week, I think you'll agree with, asking the question is, does science disprove Christianity? It was great to have Professor Richard Thompson here, wasn't it? But I thought it would be good to have these videos on our church website and on our church YouTube page so that people who either have seen them and want to look at them again or haven't had the chance can do so. So anyway, that's what we're doing, and I hope that that's a positive thing. The question today is fairly obviously, if God is a God of love, why does he allow suffering? And it's one of the big questions that I think probably everybody has got as they think about God and Christianity and the challenge that faith holds for us. And I thought I'd begin by, I'll be popping back and forth to click this, by just stating the obvious, and not a very cheerful slide, but life is unfair, we know that, don't we? And it is I just think I will be as honest and straight with you throughout this session and throughout all of these sessions as I can be, because I think we've got to just speak the truth. And life is unfair. My first job as a vicar, in fact as a curate, was in West London, near Hammersmith, at a church called St Mary's, West Kensington. And there were two lovely church members that I got to know fairly well. They were single members of our church, and then as time went on, we rejoiced when they got together and started dating and then announced their engagement. And then they were married at St Mary's Church in West Kensington, surrounded by their families and surrounded by the Christian family as well. And it was a joyful thing. But then tragedy struck, and Sandra was diagnosed with a really difficult and severe cancer. This was in the early 1990s. She endured painful treatment, but after a year or so was thankfully on the road to recovery. But then unbelievably, we discovered that Simon had another cancer, her husband. It was just like, goodness me, how could this be? And we prayed with them, we wept with them, and eventually rejoiced as they were both on the road to recovery. And then almost unbelievably, there was an even greater joy when we discovered that Sandra was pregnant, which they had longed for. And we thought really that perhaps things are turning round. And we prayed through a difficult pregnancy with all the treatment she was having, you'll understand. And then tragedy struck again when their beloved and longed for child was born stillborn. And it was heartbreaking. It was just heartbreaking. These were the loveliest people. I know it actually doesn't make it any worse, but somehow it does in human thinking, doesn't it? They were lovely people, good people, people we cared about, members of the church, and people we'd rejoiced in sharing their story with them, kind and godly people, and yet they just suffered tragedy after tragedy. It was heartbreaking, I have to be honest with you. And the point about this is it just felt so unfair. You meet or hear of other people who seem to be unpleasant people who just sort of sail through life, don't you? Let's be honest. And then some good people, things like this happen. And I'm just being honest with you about the struggle that was for us, for them, and is in life. And it's often been said, hasn't it, that one of the greatest challenges to the Christian faith is the reality of unjust suffering. And I think that's true for intellectual reasons and for personal reasons. How can it be that God allows it to happen? Is a fair question for us to ask, isn't it? How can it be that God didn't intervene and stop the Holocaust? And so we could go on with all these things through history. Why couldn't God have stopped the Rwandan genocide? And I agree that the existence of such things is a challenge to faith, and I'm just being totally straight with you about that. But it is worth remembering that suffering is not a new challenge. Indeed, significant unjust suffering has sadly been the reality of human existence, probably from the beginning of history, isn't it? In fact, let's not forget that as we talk about the people of God, the people of Israel, as we see them in the Old Testament, began their journey really with 400 years of slavery under Egypt. Unjust and cruel suffering. And furthermore, as the pictures on the screen demonstrate, Christianity itself was subject to persecution and suffering from its inception. From the crucifixion of Jesus on the right, and this depicts the stoning of Stephen, the first Christian martyr, just months probably, at the most a year or so after the death of Jesus. The persecution of Christians began, and as I'm sure you know, continues to this day. Sadly, Christians are still murdered, enslaved across North Africa by Boko Haram and other Islamic militants. They're imprisoned by the political cult of North Korea and by China, by the way, and their daughters are kidnapped and enslaved and raped in northern Nigeria, just to give a few examples. Indeed, it has been claimed, I think with some justification, that more Christians died for their faith in the 20th century than died in all the previous 19 centuries put together. And that's something to reflect upon, isn't it? And of course, that hasn't changed, sadly. The persecution of Christians still goes on. I'm not saying that that matters more than the persecution of others. I'm just making the point that for Christians and for the Christian faith, the reality of suffering is something that we've had to deal with right throughout our teaching. That's the point I'm making. I'm not saying that our suffering is any more important than anyone else's. But it does raise the question about suffering, and we do need to start to address it. So intellectually, let me move the slide on, one of the big ways that is used to challenge Christian faith is what's called the incongruent triangle or the inconsistent triad. I'm sure you've probably heard of this or something like this, even if you haven't seen the diagram. This is basically an intellectual challenge to the Christian faith, and it basically posits three truths from a Christian perspective. Christians teach that God is right at the top there, omnibenevolent or loving. Yep, that's what Christians teach. They also teach that God is omnipotent or all-powerful, and yet suffering exists. Now that is what is called an incongruent triad, and you can understand why. It's been argued, not without justification, that these three concepts are inconsistent with one another. They don't fit together. To put it simply, if God is all-powerful, as it says at the bottom left, he therefore has the power to stop suffering. And if he's all-loving, then surely he would want to stop suffering. So why is there suffering? You can see the intellectual basis of this argument, I'm sure. Yeah? And it's not an unreasonable argument. It's an argument that does have a logical basis to it, and that we need to reflect upon, and we will try to address that as we go through it. But I just wanted to lay that honestly before you as one of the challenges that people put against the Christian view of the nature of God. And it's an interesting and real challenge, isn't it? Now, one of the most common defenses of that is, again, as I'm sure you probably know, is what's called, I'll move us on the slide again, the free will defense. The free will defense argues that because God is loving, he wants what is best for us. And what is best for us is to have free will. So that's the next little bit of our slide. What is best for us is to have free will. And let me just discuss that with you for a moment. The premise of this argument really is that free will is a good thing for us to have. Free will allows us the ability to choose and to decide, to do good and to evil, to love and to hate. And in fact, both of those things are dependent upon free will. So yes, free will means that I can do bad things, but it also means that I can love. If I didn't have free will, then actually I wouldn't actually be able to love. Love wouldn't be a choice. It would just be what I'm made to do. Do you get what I'm saying? It wouldn't be real. The reality is that to be truly human, to be what we regard as truly human, we need to have a choice. We need to have a free will. The opposite side of it is that if we didn't have free will, then yes, we wouldn't be able to do evil, but we wouldn't be able to, in any real sense, do good either. So free will is absolutely vital for us to be fully human. The freedom to act, the freedom to decide, the freedom to choose those mores that are to live by, and the freedom to choose to love. We all know that the thing that actually brings us the most satisfaction and purpose in life is when we find somebody that we can love and be loved back by, isn't it? And in fact, without free will, that wouldn't be a real thing. We'd just be robots doing what we are programmed to do. It wouldn't actually be love. So we absolutely want to have free will. Without it, we would, as I've said, wouldn't be able to choose evil. We couldn't choose love either. And so love itself would become just a fiction, a nonsense. And that would be tragic, wouldn't it? But of course, the downside of that is that it means that we have a choice. The ability to do good and the ability to do evil. Now, that doesn't explain all the evil in the world, but it explains the presence of evil in the world. The fact that we have freedom is why there is evil. It means I can sometimes be nice to people, sometimes be less nice. And I think we'll be honest that we all do a bit of both of those things, don't we? So the reality is that free will, the problem with free will is that it allows the presence of evil into our world. And in fact, this is a hard truth, but I think it's true nevertheless. The existence of evil, the existence of that freedom that we have to choose evil is in fact, in part at least, a demonstration of God's love. Because it demonstrates the fact that God has given us this great gift of free will. It's a difficult thing to say, but I think that it is true. So we're talking about the free will defence. I thought I'd try to talk about its strengths and weaknesses. Again, trying to be as honest with you as I can. If we think about the free will defence, the fact that God had to give us free will for us to have the ability to both love and to do evil, I think the strength of that argument is as follows. The strength is it explains why we must have the choice to do evil, and it explains why there is evil in the world. I think we can see that. But there is a weakness to the argument. As I said, I always try to be as honest with you as I can when I do any talks, in fact. So the weaknesses of the argument are this. It fails to explain natural disasters, of course, doesn't it? It doesn't explain earthquakes, for example. And it fails to explain why God couldn't step in for the worst examples of suffering. Yeah, God has to give us free will. I can at times be grumpy with my wife and so forth, but surely God could still step in and stop the Holocaust or things like that. So there's strengths to this argument, but also weaknesses to this argument. I just wanted to be straight with you about that. But nevertheless, I think we accept that the free will defence does at least explain the existence of evil and selfishness and so forth in our world. One more thing that I did just want to say before I come to sort of the other side of the argument. We also need to remember when we talk to people about suffering, and I'm very aware of this as you have kindly come to be part of this evening, is that all of us carry some baggage, don't we? All of us here tonight, I would expect, have come here partly because we have experienced some suffering in our lives. My parents have both died. My sister died, as some of you know, 6 weeks ago. We could go on. I'm not going to put on a big sob story, but the point is that all of us, in the reality, have suffered some struggling, which is why this is such a challenge for us. And indeed, we have to be careful as Christians, speaking to those of us who would call ourselves Christians, when we talk about this. I think if somebody is hurt and in pain, and somebody says, oh, well, God loves you anyway, that's true, but it's probably not always a helpful thing to be told, is it? Do you get what I'm saying? Oh, God has given you free will, that's why this happens. That's not, I think actually what we need to do first is to just be there for people, to listen to people and to show empathy. And I think that's something that we need to be aware of as Christians when we address this issue, because for some people for whom it's an issue because it's very real and raw. And so as we talk tonight, let's be sensitive to each other and considerate of each other as best we can be, please. But anyway, that's the struggles, the intellectual struggles with the issue of suffering. But I wanted also to talk about another side of suffering, because I wanted to talk about what I've called the paradox of suffering and faith. Because there is an interesting paradox of suffering and faith. Many years ago, when I was training to be a vicar, I volunteered for 1 day a week at the Mildmay Hospital in East London, if any of you know it. This was in the late 1980s. And at that time, the Mildmay Hospital was operating as a hospice and a home for people living with AIDS. At that time, AIDS, by the way, was a terminal condition. There were none of the treatments that there are now. And Mildmay, a hospital with a strong Christian foundation, offered those living with AIDS loving and non-judgmental care and support in the last months of their lives, really. And I worked there as a volunteer. One of the people I met there was a man called Graham. Now, Graham became a personal friend of mine. And for whatever reason, we became very close. He had become a Christian before I met him and was struggling as a gay man with that. But his love for Jesus was very real and very evident. Indeed, I remember one evening when he rang me up. This is the days before mobile phones. I picked up my phone. He said, Luke, it's amazing. Jesus has answered my prayer. And he continued to tell me how he had been struggling with sexual temptation and that he had prayed for Jesus to take it away, and that to his amazement, the doctors had given him a new medicine that had significantly reduced his libido. And he rang me to tell me how wonderful it was that Jesus had helped him with his struggle. It was just amazing, but 100% true. Because you see, by this time in Graham's life, he just wanted to live for Jesus. That's all he wanted. That was all that mattered to him. All the things that had mattered to him in the past were, if not nothing, they were far less than his desire to live for Jesus. And in fact, just a few months before I had the privilege of taking Graham's funeral, he stood proud before me in that church as the godfather of my first daughter, Hannah. And it was a lovely thing to have that relationship with him and to see God working in his life. And the point of that story is this, that Graham approached death and found peace, comfort, purpose, and love in his faith in Jesus Christ. For him, the suffering didn't disprove the existence of God. On the contrary, the reality of a God who loved him helped him through those difficult last days. So we must think about, that's what I call the paradox of faith and suffering. Why is it that so many people actually turn to faith in times of suffering? And how do Christians explain for themselves suffering and deal with suffering for them and for others? And I'm just going to talk about a few of the things that help us as we face suffering, as people of faith or people of lesser faith, I don't know. The first thing that I think helps is this, the reality that God loves. That helps. It helps people when they're suffering. It is the consistent belief of Christians and of others that God does care about them and about their suffering. And many who face suffering, like my friend Graham, find this belief both a comfort and a help. Now, in a way, if you go back to the incongruent triangle, you think, oh no, it's nonsense. How can a God love you when they're suffering? But in fact, the opposite is very often true. The people in times of great suffering turn to God and find that his love is a real help. I put up a verse from the Bible that is sort of relates to this. This is obviously 1 Peter 5 verse 7, where Peter says, cast all your burdens onto him because he cares for you. And that's a reality that we can do. Of course, some people have found in the midst of suffering that this sense of God's love is, oh, don't give me that stuff. And we have to respect that. But for many people, the opposite is true. They actually find that God's love and the declaration of God's love and the reality of God's love actually helps them at the darkest times of their lives. And then there's another thing about the Christian faith that helps us in suffering. It's this amazing truth that, of course, God entered and experienced suffering in Jesus Christ. Now this is quite a deep thing to talk about, and I'll try to explain it as best I can. Of course, Christianity is a religion birthed in the unjust suffering and murder of its founder, Jesus Christ. But it's not just the unjust nature of Christ's crucifixion that inspires Christians. It's the belief that in Jesus Christ, God himself, because remember, Jesus was God, God himself experienced the reality of the suffering that we experience. Thus, both God understands our suffering, but also in some way has made suffering itself into a holy thing. And many people who go through suffering experience the reality of this. That the fact that Jesus himself suffered in so many ways carries them through and helps them through. And the sense that God knows and has entered into suffering and has blessed it and made it holy somehow helps them to deal with the suffering that they experience. God entered human suffering in Jesus Christ. And so when we suffer, he is there with us. And for many Christians, this sense of God suffering with us and for us is a reality that both empowers and strengthens us, most especially when we experience pain and hurt ourselves. And that sort of brings us on to another way that faith helps in the midst of suffering. Because faith tells us that God is with you in your suffering. You are not alone. You see, not only did God enter and experience suffering in Jesus Christ, but many Christians will also testify, and many believers will testify, to a sense of God's companionship with them in the midst of their suffering. A sense that you are not alone. For some, I know, suffering speaks of God's absence, I get that. But for a surprising number of people, they experience a real sense of divine companionship in the midst of their suffering. Some of you will know that poem, Footprints in the Sand. Have we all heard that poem? Most people know it fairly well. It's actually a truth that this, whoever wrote it, and I think it's one of those poems that is anonymous, describes seeing footprints over the journey of their life and discovering that God was in fact carrying them and helping them at the very difficult times of their lives. And many have found comfort in those truths. But perhaps even more surprising, many would testify that they found these sentiments to be true in their own experience. That they have felt God supporting them and helping them in the midst of their suffering. And for many, the sense that God has been with them in their darkest moments has been a tangible experience that has given them strength and comfort in their darkest hours. It is a quandary, but it is also true. But not only is God with us, but he also helps us through it. So yeah, a divine companion with you in your suffering is a wonderful thing, but even better is a companion who helps you to bear the suffering. And that is again what many people say that they have experienced with the person of Jesus Christ. Many Christians will testify that they have experienced the very real help that Christ gives us as we endure our suffering. It's not just that he is with us, his presence strengthens us and enables us to carry on. And then still there's more. For people of faith, we know that our suffering will end. Whatever heaven will be, and there's all sorts of debates about that, we can be sure that it will be a place where suffering will end and where evil will have come to an end. When heaven is described in the Bible, in the book of Revelation, many of you will know this verse very well, it says this of God, he will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Now that hope that one's suffering will end and that one will be with God in a place of joy and of blessing is a great strength to many people. Not to all, I get that, but to many it is. I know it's sometimes been mocked as pie in the sky when you die, and I understand that. But for many people, the promise that there is a future with God where suffering and pain will end gives them real strength and comfort, particularly as death approaches. And as a vicar, I've had the privilege of sitting with people in the last hours of their death. I had the privilege of sitting with another lady, again at that same church in Hammersmith, when her baby died after 3 days, and I sat with her and held her and her child during those 3 days. We experienced quite a lot in this job, actually, and it's a great privilege, actually, to do so. And again, we find that God helps people, and this promise that there is life beyond death, a life of blessing and joy, is a great strength and comfort to many people. And then there's another part of suffering, and this is again part of the paradox of suffering. And again, I say this with some hesitation because I'm sure there are people here for whom this suffering is a present reality. But we do learn and grow through suffering. And that's quite a hard thing for some people to hear, but it is a truth, and an amazing truth. In one of my previous jobs as a vicar, when I was a vicar in South London, I was the chaplain, a Christian minister, working in a home for people with very severe disabilities. It was originally called the British Home and Hospital for Incurables. What a terrible name that was. But by the time I went there, it was just called the British Home. But anyway, I was the chaplain there. But it was one of the great privileges of my ministerial life to work there. You would have thought that these people, some of whom had suffered massive head injuries in car accidents or through operations when parts of their brain had to be cut out and so forth, others who had been born with significant physical and intellectual limitations, you would have thought that they would be bitter and angry to be God, but the opposite was true. I met people who found both hope and comfort in God, and they challenged me when I found myself moaning at my lesser sufferings, which we all do a little bit at times, don't we? And I would just be humbled by it, to be quite honest with you. I also had the privilege, as I've already said, of working at the Mildmay in the early 80s, and again, standing and sitting and praying alongside people for whom pain and suffering and loss were a real thing. And sitting alongside them was a great privilege, it really was. But once again, I found that the reality of God's presence and help was both real and valued by those who suffered. And moreover, what struck me powerfully at both of these places was that in the midst of affliction, I found that people sometimes felt blessed through suffering, bizarrely. Not blessed that they were suffering, but that God was with them and was blessing them and helping them in the midst of what they faced. And I thought I'd just describe some of the things that I have experienced in my own life and heard other people say about how they have grown in the midst of suffering. Here's some of the things that I've known people say they grow with. Some say they grow in their relationship with God. Others say that they learn empathy and love for others in their suffering. Others say they learn what's really important in life and in eternity. Others learn patience and resilience. Others say they've learned to receive and to value the love and care from others. That's quite a big thing for some people to learn. They can struggle to receive from others. But actually, as they face suffering, they learn just to receive blessings from others. That's quite a powerful thing to learn, actually. Others say how they learned how fragile life is. They learn the greater worth of eternity and of our hope in heaven. Others learn that God uses our suffering to bless, strengthen, and encourage others in their suffering. That's a really powerful thing. Actually, sometimes people will look at somebody and say, isn't it amazing how they're getting through this? And that can give them strength to face what they're going through. Sometimes I've known people, particularly I can think of a couple of people I knew when I was at the Mildmay, who used that time to put relationships right that had previously been fractured or broken. I've known people like Graham who learned to put God first in all things. I've known people who learned to reject bitterness and self-pity and to replace it with love and thankfulness. I've known people say that suddenly small blessings in the midst of their suffering become real signs of God's love and provision for them. and they start to value the small things in life. I've known people say they've had a much greater sense of God's presence with them. And I've also known, again, thinking of a Graham, of temptations and weaknesses that once controlled them that were taken away and lose their appeal so that they move on in holiness and love for God. That's quite a list, isn't it? I've got 14 bullet points there of ways that one can grow through suffering. Now, I'm sure others could add to that list, but it's an astonishing retinue of blessings that can flow from suffering. And indeed, many of those sufferings, those lessons I would suggest to you, can actually only be learned at the place of suffering. Now, in my own times of pain and loss, I can't honestly say I've learned all of those things, but I've learned some of them. Am I therefore thankful for my sufferings? Well, no, of course not. To say that would be dishonest and nonsense, wouldn't it? But I can say that I thank God for his blessings in the midst of my sufferings. Of that I can certainly say. So it's clear, you see, when we look at suffering and what happens in the midst of suffering, that painful and unwelcome though it is, it can produce a harvest of growth that we might never have achieved without it. That's quite something to think about, isn't it? That God might use this to help us to grow and become better people. So it's quite a thought, isn't it, that we can learn and grow through suffering. I thought I'd just end, and then we'll have a question time, and then we'll serve some refreshments if you'd like to stay and just chat, with just thinking about, in contrast to what we've said here, what actually is the opposite side, what it's like, what we miss out on if we suffer but without God with us. And I think it's just worth reflecting on. You see, as Christians, we know that God is with us. Suffering, as you know, most of us here will know, can be lonely, even with the love of and care of family and friends. And in most cases, your families will, of course, stay with you when dark times comes. But for Christians, there is an eternal companion who never goes home, who never tires, who takes our hands and walks with us in the secret struggles of our hearts. But without God, there is no such companion. And that's something to reflect upon, isn't it? Here's another thing to reflect upon. Sorry. No future hope. Again, for those of us who have faith, we can approach death with hope, actually, and believe that there is a better future awaiting us. But for those who have no sense of God and no hope for tomorrow, well, all there is an ending and a ceasing to exist. In fact, Sarah will know that a member of our family has actually said to us that he really struggles with the concept of death because he can't cope with the thought of him no longer existing. Many people do struggle with that. But you know, if we have the privilege of faith, death holds no fear for us. As Paul writes in Romans, death, where is your sting? Where is your victory? That's quite something for us to have. Another thing about, imagine going through this without God. I put this too strongly, actually. I looked at that and I shouldn't have put no real growth. I think there is less opportunity for growth if you haven't got God with you, teaching you these lessons through life. So I think perhaps I've written that a bit too strongly. But here is the truth. As we said, that God can use our suffering to do so much in our lives, but without God, I would suggest that our suffering has no purpose. It's just an unfortunate turn of the dice. It means nothing and counts for nothing. It is just tough. So I thought I'd conclude by putting a verse upon the screen, a verse of encouragement for us. And it says this: whoever dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. Dear friends, there is no doubt that suffering is often cruel, unfair, and painful. However, whilst there are no easy answers to the challenge of suffering, it seems clear to me at least that suffering is not a slam dunk proof that God is not real, as some suggest. Rather, the reality of God and the experience of his love and of his working through our sufferings are the only things that make sense of the pain, hurt and loss. So thank you so much for listening this evening, and I hope that some of what I've said is of some help and comfort to you all. God bless you. Thank you. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a time for people to ask questions. You can ask any questions, but it's not just for me to answer. Perhaps we can help and answer each other. And then after that, we'll have a time when refreshments will be served. There's tea, coffee, and I've even treated you to some wine because I thought we might need it tonight. So that is there. But does anybody have any particular questions that they'd like to ask? I know it's quite a difficult subject, but thank you, Roland, for starting us off.
I was 67 before I found God and the Holy Spirit came. Prior to that, I hadn't missed God in my life. That's the first point. The second point is, what's the point of prayer? You didn't use the word prayer once. In my experience, prayer is random. It might answer somebody's question, and then somebody gets well, little kid of 2.5 dies.
Yeah.
So we didn't mention the word prayer. I would have thought that would have been something we would use.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know what to say about the first point. I mean, the fact that you didn't miss God, I totally understand. You don't miss what you don't know. But now that you know him, I think you would miss him if he was suddenly taken away. Yeah. Yeah. But anyway, you hadn't. There's a verse that says, "Taste and see that the Lord is good." And until you have tasted, you don't really get what it is that you're missing. But you've obviously tasted, and I get that. Prayer is a wonderful thing. What is prayer? It's really interesting that when the disciples, this is Matthew chapter 6, when the disciples asked Jesus to teach them to pray, he doesn't say, give me a prayer, a list of your requests. He teaches them the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. So it begins with worship. Then he prays, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Then he moves on to submission to God and so forth. Yeah? And then he continues to go through it. So the Lord's Prayer is really interesting. It's about worship. It's about prayer. There is that bit about asking God, give us today our daily bread, but there's also confession of our sins. And then, of course, it ends by asking for God's help in temptation and then by returning to worship. And so what we see when we look at what Jesus teaches us about prayer is that prayer is actually just about relationship. Prayer is talking to God. So if I wanted to talk to you and all I ever said to you was, Roland, can you lend me a $5? Roland, can you buy me a pint? Roland, can you buy me a takeaway? If all I ever did was ask you stuff, you'd soon think, stuff, Luke, wouldn't you? I'd be getting on your nerves. A real relationship is far deeper than that, isn't it? It's about talking and conversing, listening. It's about, yes, asking things, but also giving things. It's about giving people their due respect. And so what Jesus was teaching us when he teaches us the Lord's Prayer was that actually prayer is about how we can have a relationship with God, how we can meet with him and talk to him and know him. And in fact, I would say to all of us here, if you want to grow in your relationship with God, then spend time praying to him every day. And I would advise you to use the Lord's Prayer as a model, generally. You don't have to, but that would be my advice, because I think that's the one Jesus gave us. Read the Bible a bit every day, just a few verses. Pray every day, and you'll grow in knowing God. And that's what prayer is about. It's not a list of, God, I want you to put this right, and this right, and this right, and this right. It's growing in a relationship with God. And that's a wonderful thing to have. Jonathan, and then Sarah.
Hi, Luke. Thank you for that, by the way. I noticed throughout you seem to place a degree of emphasis on the catalytic qualities of suffering and how it can enable people to either become closer to God or develop proximity to God. That I would suggest is only capable of people with a consciousness and ability to understand at some level, the ability to comprehend God, if you like. I'd be interested to know, because I don't know, what your or the church's attitude is towards the purpose of the suffering of innocents who perhaps don't have that cognitive ability.
Well, that's a good question. I don't know the complete answer to that, but again, coming back to working at the British Home, I remember Annie. Now, Annie was born with very severe physical and mental limitations. She couldn't speak, but she was on, funny enough, she was sort of cruciform. She was on this sort of bed, not quite lying down, but she was sort of lying down, and her arms were out like that. And she'd flick her right hand for yes and her left hand for no, and that was basically the limits of her communication. But it's actually amazing when you get to know somebody, and I was chaplain there for 7 years, how much communication you can get with that once you get to know things. And so we got to know her. We got to know that she would come to chapel every Sunday at 2 o'clock. We did a service in the British Home Chapel, and she loved it. Always came. You could see the joy in her face, and as she was just making noises, but I would say singing along. And we got to know, and in the end we could say to her, Annie, do you like this song? And so you knew, and we got to know the songs that Annie liked, and the songs that she didn't like, and the Bible passages that she liked. And here was a person with a very, in our human understanding thing, limited intellectual and physical capability. But I know that she was loved by God, and she knew that she was loved by God. And I know that I'll meet her again one day in heaven, when she will be made into everything that God wanted her to be. And that's a wonderful thing. And so it doesn't completely answer your question, but every human being is loved by God, and he will speak to them in ways that are relevant to them and reach out to them in ways that are relevant to them, as he did with Annie. And it was quite an honour and a privilege to get to know this lady. It really was. So all I can say is this, that God loves these people and that he will reach out to them in some way and find out a way to reach out to them. So I hope that at least partly answers what you're asking. Yeah. Sarah, you wanted to ask something.
Just sort of going to Roland's question about prayer. There's lots of places in the Bible where it says, ask and you shall be given.
Yeah.
And so when you have hundreds of people asking God to cure somebody or to stop a war or things, how come? How come he doesn't answer the prayer?
Yeah, I totally hear that, and I haven't got a good answer to that, is the honest truth of it. Certainly in terms of stopping a war, I mean, the whole free will, I suppose, is a bit of a get-out clause on that one. But you're absolutely right. We're very in tune on this, aren't we? We have a relative who's in a very serious physical state with a very advanced cancer. So, but I can't give you an honest answer to that. But all I can say is this: that it was an Archbishop of Canterbury who said, somebody said to him, when you pray and it gets an answer, it's just a coincidence. And he said, well, the more I pray, the more coincidences happen. And that is my experience. I wish I could say all my prayers were answered. They're not. But a surprising number are. In fact, I looked at my prayer list this morning and I put a little tick. I've learned that. Somebody said to me when I was a young Christian, because I used to have, in those days, a physical piece of paper where I'd write down the things I was praying for. Then after a while, I'd write it out again and get rid of those things that had, because, and they said, don't cross them out, don't throw it away, put a tick. And so that you can see all those things that God has answered. And God does answer prayer. Not all of them. I wish I could say all of them, but a surprising number of them. Not some of the big ones sometimes, but sometimes some of the big ones. So all I can say to you is, firstly, that prayer is not just giving God a wish list. It's about building a relationship with him, which is what I was saying to Roland. But secondly, I would say, do keep praying. God does work in our families' lives, in our loved ones' lives, often in surprising ways. Not always as we'd wish, but he does. And I'm accepting, and I'm being completely honest with us all here, that we've all had, myself included, people. My mum died when she was 56. I prayed for her, I can assure you of that. But so I'm not making light of it, what you're saying. It's very real. But I have had enough times in my life when I've prayed and seen God work for me to believe that prayer is worthwhile doing.
Surely it's just the luck of the draw, isn't it? Win some, lose some.
Well, I don't quite put it like that. I love your turn of phrase. You're quite stark, but and I love you for it. In the end, I think we have to trust God's purposes. I think I know on me. My mum died when she was 56, but I had the privilege, as some of you know, of sitting with her in a hospital and of talking to her about Jesus Christ and of her giving her life to Christ in the hours before she died. Now that was the ultimate healing. I will see her again. And I thank God for that. I really do. She wasn't cured of the cancer, but yeah, so. Sorry, Pete.
I was very moved when I was watching Ben-Hur in 1998, and it was coming to the end of the programme, and suddenly it was flashed across the screen. There was peace in Northern Ireland. They had the Good Friday Agreement.
Oh, right, yes.
And that seemed sort of kind of, wow, lots of kind of things happening at the same time. And that was very moving and
Yeah.
in several ways. So.
Yeah. And I think we have to hold these things together. We have to be honest. What Sarah said is real, isn't it? We've all had people that we prayed for and it hasn't happened. I'm not going to lie to you about that. But if we do pray, there'll be times when we pray and we do see God work. I'd rather keep praying and have those times when I do see God work for all, because that's how I see it. Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else? Jeremy?
Not so much a question, more an observation. In my life, I've had sort of 3 separate careers,
Yeah.
and they were all fairly successful. But at the end of the first one, I went into the Slough of Despond because I didn't want it to end. It was going so well, and forces beyond my control. It ended. And then the second one, and then looking back, I could see why the first one had ended, because the second one opened up.
Yeah.
But I'm a slow learner. When the second one went pear-shaped, again beyond my control, I went again into the Slough of Despond. And then the third one opened up, and I could see why it had happened afterwards. So maybe the prayer is like the heart's longing is a message in itself, because that's what you're really wanting at that time. And you don't always recognise the answer immediately, because it takes time. Yeah. And then it was wonderful.
Yes. Well, thank you for saying that. And I think we can all echo what you're saying. There are times when we all fall into that Slough of Despond and feel miserable because of X, Y, or Z. And I think that's just a very real human reaction, isn't it? You know. And there are times when we can see how God's working. There are times when it's not so clear, I think. Just to be honest. But prayer, I think, is a wonderful thing. But I'm happy to keep talking about prayer, but I just want, if people have got questions about suffering, I don't want people to not be able to ask their questions. I'm happy to answer questions on just about anything.
I have another difficult one.
Okay, Jeremy will answer that.
About natural disasters, about tsunamis and earthquakes and things. God made this world.
Yeah.
God doesn't make mistakes. So can you explain why so many people suffer through natural disasters?
Not really, no. The only answer, again, I just always try to be honest. The only answer I've ever heard, but it doesn't quite work for me, is that when you look at the whole Genesis story about man being thrown out of Eden, there's an argument that what actually happened there was, and you know that there's these pictures of suffering coming in as a result of that, was that basically what we've done is we've sort of wrenched control of this world from God. And I've heard it described like this: it's a bit like a car. If you don't take your car to the mechanic and get him to maintain it, then after a while the car will stutter and break down and fail. And I've heard the argument that that's what's happening to our world. That because the world is not taken to the mechanic, it is stuttering and breaking down and failing. I can see the argument of that. It doesn't quite work for me, but I can see there's perhaps something in there, but not enough, yeah.
So this is just a comment about that question, that God did make the world,
Yeah.
and it isn't static. Things still are continuing to happen. There are volcanoes in Iceland and other places. There is movement, and I'm no scientist, but you might know the answer. Because Di is a scientist. But it's possible that the world is still doing things that enable it to keep its reign.
Yeah.
Keep a world that is something that can keep us all alive in. And there are consequences, and yes, we will see it as a complete disaster when thousands of people get killed in a tsunami. But you don't know, but maybe it's for a greater good in the end.
Yeah, I think that's hard if it was somebody, and I'm not dissing what you're saying at all, but I think it's hard if it's somebody you love who's in that. I think another thing to bear in mind with, of course, earthquakes and volcanoes and things like this, is I do think that one of the factors is poverty. We know where earthquakes are, we know where volcanoes are. Why are people still living there? It's because of people who are being forced in poverty to live in these flood zones in Bangladesh and so forth, isn't it? So that certainly a lot of the suffering that comes from natural disasters could be mitigated if we as a human species were more fair in how we shared out our resources, I think, to be honest with you. But even so, I think that there are still genuine questions to be asked. But yeah.
When Luke was talking, you were talking a lot about people who were already Christians and how they found that God's help, his strength, got them through all their suffering, or a lot of their suffering, or at least they knew he was there and they could. But you kept dotting in with that. Of course, not everybody feels that, and that went. And each time there were a group of people, and I do know those people, who haven't found God, and it isn't because they haven't asked or they haven't thought about it. It isn't because they're evil, awful people. But he hasn't reached them. They haven't reached him. They haven't managed to get together.
I hear that, and I can't give a 100% answer to it. I do believe that if we truly seek God, we'll find him.
I have a really good friend who has had a lot of, one of these awful lives that things keep happening. And she has never stopped going to church. She's never stopped being part of the church community and praying. She loves Jesus. Yeah. And she cannot find peace in her life. Yeah. I keep praying for peace. I keep praying for it. I cannot find that peace. Yes. But she won't give up. She keeps going. But she's.
Well, bless her. If she loves Jesus, then that's a wonderful thing. I don't think I ever said that there's a guarantee that you'll have peace. I mean, Graham died. That's the honest truth. Yeah. He found help in the midst of his struggle here, but there was times of pain, there was times of unpleasant illness. I remember.
Can I just interject? It took God 46 years to answer a prayer of mine. And for 46 years, I couldn't understand why he wasn't answering that prayer. So maybe it's just a question of time.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Can I say something else?
Yes, by all means, yes.
In response to that, it took me a long time before I heard in our Church of England that one could invite the Holy Spirit into one's life. Yeah. And I found that was so helpful, because things did change for me. Yeah. So please tell anybody that's struggling, if they haven't thought of doing it, to invite the Holy Spirit to come into their lives and see what happens.
Yeah. Which is just the Spirit of God, by the way, in case the jargon bothers you. You're just inviting the Spirit of God to come and fill your life, and he longs to do so. And again, there'll still be difficult times in your life, but it really is, you're absolutely right, such a wonderful thing for us to do. So thank you. But yes, just keep praying for your friend. I do hear what you're saying, and I'm not making light of it. But what she has received is I think, she must have an assurance of God's love. God does love her, and that will help. God will help her, and you know, the more she prays, the more she cries out to God, the more he will help her. But that doesn't mean that there won't be dark days. I remember some difficult times with Graham towards the end of his life. You know, it is, you know, these diseases are very difficult. Yeah.
When I was 17, my small sister, who was 6, developed tubercular meningitis.
Yeah.
Hundreds of people were praying because my father was well known in Lancashire as a preacher, but she died. He did pray, kept saying to people, pray that if it's God's will,
Yes.
she will recover.
Yeah.
But now, looking back on life, it helps me to look on life as either a painting or a tapestry. And we're part of that painting. We're a very tiny part. And to make a painting or a tapestry be meaningful, there have to be light periods, light and dark. And that is true of life. But we only see a small part. God sees the whole. And that's often why we can't understand. But he understands.
Thank you. And even as you say that, I was reminded, if you know the story of Joseph in the Old Testament, Joseph, not the human father of Jesus. It's an amazing story of a guy who sins and improves, but who suffers and then does the right thing and then suffers again, then does the right thing, then suffers again, and then God in the end restores so many things in his life. But that, you know, that it's an amazing picture of how life is, that life does have its dark times and its good times, times when totally unjustly things happened to Joseph, didn't they? You know, Potiphar's wife was totally unjust what happened to him, but it happened, even though he was a godly man at that time. So I'm not at all saying in this, and if I was unclear in that, I'm sorry, that being a person of faith will save you from suffering or save you from hard times. That is not the truth. There are times when you'll be really aware of God's help. There'll be times when it's really dark and really difficult, but God is with you and God loves you and God can give you strength and help in the midst of those things. So that's the reality that I have certainly experienced in my life. As I said, when I was with my mum when she died, you know, that was a painful and difficult thing to go through. And I was praying for her to be healed. Didn't happen. She gave her life to the Lord, and I thank the God for that, but she wasn't physically healed. So we will all experience these things, but I would rather experience them with God with me, and to know the reality of his presence and his love and his help, which I have found to be very real in life, and many people have. And that, I think, is one of the amazing things about suffering. People say, oh, suffering, that God can't be loving if there's suffering, but actually so many people, and this is what I've been trying to say this evening, actually find that in the midst of suffering, they find that God is there helping them. Not necessarily making everything 100% better, but helping them and being real and giving them strength and help in the midst of that. And that's actually a precious thing to have. Doesn't mean you won't still have your struggles, doesn't mean you won't still have your dark days, but it means that when those days come, you will have a companion with you, the Holy Spirit. And that's a precious and helpful thing to have. So I hope that encourages you and helps you. Any further questions, or shall we go to tea, coffee, and a glass of wine, perhaps? Please keep talking. Thank you so much for being here this evening. I hope that's been helpful. Forgive me if anything has been unhelpful. It's offered with love and honesty, but I'm really grateful to you all for coming here tonight, and may God bless you and help you. And if you ever want to talk, I and others in the church would be very happy to talk and to just pray with you or to just listen to you if that would be a help to you. Thank you all so much, and God bless you. I'll come and we'll serve some drinks and refreshments.